290. The only girl to escape the Wagon massacre is found by a rancher who lost his daughter. The summer of 1871 brought relentless heat across the Kansas plains, turning creek beds to dust and leaving livestock gasping beneath the merciless sun. But the cruelty of nature paled compared to the savagery of man. This is the story of Emma Sullivan, just 12 years old, when she witnessed her entire family slaughtered in a brutal wagon train attack, forcing her to flee into the wilderness alone, haunted by screams that would never leave her. And it's the story of Thomas Ward, a former Union cavalry officer turned reclusive rancher who had buried his own daughter 3 years earlier, only to discover Emma half-starved and wild-eyed at the edge of his property, a chance encounter that would challenge everything both believed about loss, redemption, and what it truly means to find home after unspeakable tragedy. Before we jump in, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow we've saved an extraordinary tale of survival against impossible odds that you won't want to miss. The attack came at dawn, when the Sullivan family and the other 4 families in their small wagon train were still shaking off sleep. Emma had been collecting kindling for the morning fire when she heard the first screams. Through gaps in the scrubby trees, she saw them, at least 20 riders, faces painted for war, sweeping through the camp with terrible efficiency. Her father, a blacksmith from Ohio, with dreams of establishing a shop in the Colorado Territory, had just enough time to shout for them to run before an arrow struck him in the chest. Emma's mother grabbed her 4-year-old brother James and fled toward the tree line where Emma stood frozen in horror. "Run, Emma!" her mother screamed, just before a mounted attacker overtook her. Emma couldn't look away as her mother fell, somehow still shielding little James with her body, even as she collapsed. The attacking warrior circled back, and Emma finally found her legs, plunging deeper into the trees as death descended on everyone she had ever loved. For 3 days, Emma wandered the plains, moving only at night and hiding during daylight. Her thin calico dress offered little protection against the elements, and the simple leather shoes her father had made were falling apart with each mile. She drank from muddy puddles when she could find them, and chewed on wild grass when hunger became too intense to bear. The braids her mother had carefully plaited each morning unraveled, leaving her once golden hair a tangled curtain that she used to hide her face when she thought she heard riders approaching. On the 4th day, delirious with thirst and grief, she stumbled upon a small stream that cut through a property marked by barbed wire fencing, a relatively new invention that her father had once described as the future of the frontier. Following the stream, she eventually spotted a distant farmhouse with smoke rising from its chimney despite the summer heat. Emma collapsed at the edge of a cornfield, the tall stalks hiding her from view as darkness claimed her consciousness. Thomas Ward had not slept properly in 3 years, not since the coughing sickness had taken his beloved daughter Sarah and his wife Rebecca within weeks of each other. He'd come west after Gettysburg with wounds both visible and hidden, the saber scar that ran from temple to jaw on the left side of his face, and the deeper scars of what he had witnessed across dozens of battlefields. Rebecca had been his salvation, her quiet strength helping to ease the terrors that woke him, shouting in the night. Sarah, born a year after they settled this harsh Kansas land, had been his joy, her curious mind and determined spirit promising a future worth building. Without them, Thomas carried on by force of habit, expanding his small cattle operation, trading fairly with both settlers and the occasionally peaceful tribal members who passed through his lands, and drinking just enough whiskey each night to mute the silence of his too empty home. The neighboring homesteaders had eventually stopped, inviting him to their gatherings, tired of his taciturn presence and the shadow he seemed to cast over any attempt at merriment. That morning, Thomas had risen before dawn, as always, unable to find comfort in his bed. He lit the stove, still using it despite the heat, as coffee was one of his few remaining pleasures, and stepped onto his porch to watch the sun climb above the eastern horizon. His cattle would need checking, especially with the ongoing drought forcing them to range farther for decent grazing. The corn he'd planted was somehow surviving, though the ears would be smaller this year unless rain came soon. Thomas had just mounted his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Commander, when his cattle dog Buck began barking insistently near the cornfield. The dog rarely raised alarms without cause. Mountain lions occasionally ventured this far east, and rustlers were always a concern for an operation as small as his, where the loss of even a few head could mean the difference between survival and ruin. "What is it, boy?" Thomas called, turning Commander toward the disturbance. Buck disappeared into the corn, his barking changing from warning to something more urgent. Thomas dismounted, drawing the Remington revolver he'd carried since the war, and cautiously followed the dog's sounds. What he found stopped him cold, a child unconscious, skin reddened from sun exposure, clothes torn and dirty. For one impossible moment, his mind played the cruelest trick, superimposing Sarah's face over this stranger's features. Then reality reasserted itself, and Thomas holstered his weapon, kneeling beside the girl to check for signs of life. "Hey, there," he said gruffly, his voice rusty from disuse. "Can you hear me?" The girl's eyelids fluttered. When they opened, her gaze was unfocused, delirious. "Papa," she whispered. Thomas felt a pain in his chest that had nothing to do with his old war wounds. "No, child, I'm Thomas Ward. This is my land you're on." Fear flooded the girl's face, and she tried to scramble away, but lacked the strength to move more than a few inches. "Don't hurt me," she pleaded, raising thin arms to shield herself. "I won't hurt you," Thomas said, trying to gentle his voice, aware of how imposing his scarred face and large frame must appear to a frightened child. "You're hurt. Need water. Food." The girl stared at him warily, thirst eventually overcoming fear. When Thomas offered his canteen, she grabbed it with surprising strength and drank deeply until he had to take it back. "Easy now. Too much at once. We'll make you sick." Thomas debated what to do. The nearest doctor was in Council Grove, a half-day's ride away. The girl needed immediate attention. Her cracked lips, sunken eyes, and the heat radiating from her skin told him that much. Making a decision, he reached toward her as slowly and non-threateningly as he could manage. "I'm going to take you to my house, get you cooled down and fed, all right?" The girl didn't respond verbally, but she didn't fight when he carefully lifted her. She weighed almost nothing, reminding him painfully of carrying Sarah during her final days, when the illness had whittled her down to almost nothing. The girl's head lolled against his shoulder as he carried her to Commander, somehow managing to mount while still holding her securely. By the time they reached the house, the girl was unconscious again. Thomas carried her inside, placing her on Sarah's bed, a space he normally avoided entirely, the door usually remaining firmly closed against the memories contained within. He pushed aside his discomfort and focused on the task at hand, wetting a cloth with water from the pitcher on the washstand and bathing the girl's face and arms to bring down her temperature. "What happened to you?" he murmured, though he had seen enough of the frontier to hazard some grim guesses. The nearest homestead was over 15 miles away, and the last wagon train he'd heard of had passed through the area nearly a week ago, heading for the Colorado Territory. For a child to be alone out here meant disaster had struck, the kind that left no survivors except somehow this girl. Thomas forced himself to focus on practicalities. He coaxed water between the girl's lips at regular intervals, adding a bit of salt and sugar as his mother had taught him long ago helped with heat sickness. He prepared a thin broth, knowing she would need something gentle on her empty stomach when she finally woke properly. And he waited, settling into the straight-backed chair in the corner of Sarah's room, watching over this unexpected visitor as darkness fell. Emma drifted through layers of consciousness, fragments of memory colliding with present reality. Her fever dreams. She ran endlessly from mounted attackers, heard her mother's final scream, saw her little brother's frightened face. Then other images intruded, a bearded man with a scarred face, the cool relief of water, unfamiliar walls. Around her instead of the vast, uncaring sky. When she finally opened her eyes with some clarity, moonlight was streaming through a small window. She lay on a real bed, covered with a patchwork quilt, in a room that clearly belonged to someone else. Faded yellow curtains framed the window, and a child's drawing was pinned to the wall. A house with a stick-figure family standing beside it, the meticulous printing beneath reading, "My Home" by Sarah Ward. Movement in the corner startled her. The bearded man sat there, his head tilted uncomfortably against the wall in sleep, one hand still resting on a rifle across his lap. Not pointing at her, but clearly ready. In the silvery moonlight, the scar on his face looked like a second, ghostly feature. Emma tried to sit up, but her body betrayed her with weakness, and she couldn't suppress a small whimper of pain. The sound woke the man instantly, his hand tightening on the rifle before his eyes found her and recognition dawned. "You're awake," he said, setting the weapon aside and leaning forward. "That's good. Been worried you might not come around proper." Emma pressed herself against the headboard, trying to put distance between them. "Who are you? Where am I?" "Name's Thomas Ward," he replied, keeping his distance when he noticed her fear. "This is my ranch, about 30 miles northeast of Council. Grove, found you collapsed at the edge of my cornfield yesterday morning?" Yesterday, Emma had lost an entire day. She glanced around the room again, her eyes lingering on the drawing. "Whose room is this?" A shadow passed over Thomas's face. "My daughter's. Sarah, she isn't here anymore." Something in his voice, a carefully controlled pain, made Emma momentarily forget her own fear. "She died?" Thomas nodded once, his jaw tightening. 3 years ago. Consumption. Her and her mother both." "I'm sorry," Emma said automatically. The politeness her mother had drilled into her surfacing even through her trauma. Thomas acknowledged this with a slight nod, then changed the subject. "Think you could manage some broth? Need to get your strength back." Emma's stomach answered for her, growling audibly. Thomas almost smiled, a slight softening around his eyes that transformed his stern face momentarily, and left the room, returning shortly with a mug of warm broth. "Can you hold it?" he asked, offering it to her. Emma reached out, but her hands trembled too badly. Without comment, Thomas sat on the edge of the bed and held the mug to her lips, supporting her head with his other hand. The gentleness of the gesture from such a weathered, formidable man brought unexpected tears to Emma's eyes, which she fought desperately to control. After she had drunk about half the broth, Thomas set the mug aside. "What's your name, child?" "Emma," she whispered. "Emma Sullivan." "How old are you, Emma Sullivan?" 12. "Nearly 13, she added, feeling the need to claim whatever maturity she could. Thomas nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "Emma, I need to know what happened, how you came to be out there alone. Were you part of a wagon train?" The question broke the fragile dam holding back her memories. "They killed them," she gasped, the words tearing from her throat. "All of them, Mama and Papa and little James, the Petersons, the Caldwells, everyone." "Who did?" Thomas asked, his voice gentle but insistent. "Indians," Emma said, the word barely audible. "War paint, so many of them. They came at dawn. I was collecting kindling in the trees. I saw... Thomas raised a hand, stopping her. "That's enough for now. You're safe here." But Emma couldn't stop now that the words had begun. "Mama told me to run. I ran and hid. For days. I couldn't help them. I should have helped them. Sobs racked her body. Pain that had been held at bay by shock and the struggle for survival finally breaking through. To her surprise, Thomas didn't attempt awkward reassurances or platitudes. Instead, he simply sat with her, solid and present, allowing her grief its voice. When her sobs finally subsided from exhaustion, he spoke. There was nothing you could have done, Emma, nothing except what you did, survive, and that took courage. Not courage, Emma whispered, just fear. Sometimes they're the same thing, Thomas replied, a distant look in his eyes suggesting he knew something about this truth. You should rest more. Dawn will be here soon enough. As he rose to leave, Emma was seized by sudden panic at the thought of being alone with her memories. Please, she said, hating the weakness in her voice. Could you stay just until I fall asleep? Thomas hesitated in the doorway, something complicated passing across his features. Then he nodded once and returned to the chair in the corner. I'll be here, he promised, his deep voice grounding her against the terrors that lurked in the darkness. As Emma drifted toward sleep, she found herself studying her unlikely guardian. His hands were large and calloused, but they had been gentle when helping her drink. His face was stern, marked by hardship and that dramatic scar, but his eyes held a sadness that somehow made him less frightening. He was nothing like her father, who had been quick to smile and full of dreams about their new life in Colorado. Yet something about Thomas Ward's solid presence provided a kind of security she had not expected to feel ever again. Outside, a coyote called lonely into the night, the sound carrying across the vast Kansas plains. Inside the bedroom of a ghost child, two strangers bound by separate tragedies kept silent vigil against the encroaching darkness. One standing guard, the other finally surrendering to exhaustion, both unaware that their chance encounter had already begun to alter the course of their broken lives. Thomas watched as the girl finally succumbed to sleep, her face relaxing despite the tears that had dried on her cheeks. He should get some rest himself. The cattle wouldn't check themselves. Come morning, and there were always 1,000 tasks waiting on a ranch this size, with only one pair of hands to manage them. Yet he remained in the chair, oddly reluctant to leave this unexpected visitor alone. Dawn arrived with the rooster's insistent crowing, pulling Thomas from the uncomfortable doze he'd fallen into. His neck protested the awkward angle it had been forced to maintain in the straight-backed chair. For a disorienting moment, he couldn't understand why he was in Sarah's room, a space he avoided religiously, until his eyes fell on the sleeping child in the bed. The events of yesterday rushed back, his cattle dog Buck finding her at the edge of the cornfield, her delirium and fear, the terrible story of a massacre that had left her the sole survivor of what sounded like a brutal attack on a small wagon train. Thomas rose quietly, stretching to ease his stiff muscles. Emma slept soundly now, her breathing deep and regular, some color returning to her previously sun-scorched cheeks. She looked younger in sleep, the wariness that had tightened her features when awake now absent. Perhaps 13, as she claimed, but small for her age, with a dusting of freckles across her nose and tangled blonde hair that reminded him, with a painful jolt, of Sarah's. He slipped from the room, careful not to wake her. There were chores that wouldn't wait, not even for orphaned children or a rancher's complicated emotions. The cattle needed checking, especially with the ongoing drought forcing them to range farther for decent grazing. Buck followed him outside, eager for the morning routine. The air already carried the promise of another scorching day, the horizon wavering with heat, though the sun had barely cleared it. Thomas saddled Commander, his thoughts circling around what to do about the girl. The nearest town with any real authority was Council Grove, where the sheriff might know something about a wagon train massacre. Perhaps relatives could be located. Back east, Someone who would want a traumatized child more than a scarred, solitary rancher with too many ghosts haunting his empty rooms. As Thomas rode the boundaries of his property, checking on his scattered herd, he tried to imagine what Rebecca would tell him to do in this situation. His wife had possessed a wisdom about people that he had always lacked, an intuitive understanding of what others needed. She would know how to comfort the girl, how to help her navigate the devastating loss of everyone she loved. "What would you do, Beck?" he murmured to the endless sky, using the pet name that no one had spoken aloud since her passing. The wind offered no answers, just the endless rustling of prairie grass and the distant lowing of cattle. Thomas completed his circuit, finding the herd in reasonable condition despite the drought conditions. The creek that crossed his property still held water, though lower than he'd ever seen it this early in the summer. If rain didn't come soon, difficult decisions would need to be made about selling off part of the herd. When Thomas returned to the house nearly 3 hours later, he was surprised to find Emma awake and sitting at his kitchen table, her thin hands wrapped around a mug of water. She had attempted to tame her wild hair, though without much success, and had splashed water on her face. The fear in her eyes had receded somewhat, replaced by wariness and exhaustion. "You're up," Thomas said unnecessarily, setting his hat on its peg by the door. Emma nodded. "I didn't know if I should." She gestured vaguely at the stove. "Hungry?" Thomas asked, already moving to stoke the fire in the cast-iron monster that dominated one wall of the kitchen. "Yes, sir," she replied, the politeness so at odds with her bedraggled appearance that it almost made Thomas smile. "No need for sir," he said, pulling out a skillet. "Thomas will do." He set about making a simple breakfast, cornmeal mush, with a bit of molasses and the last of his side pork. He worked methodically, aware of Emma's eyes tracking his movements. The silence stretched between them, not entirely uncomfortable, but heavy with unasked questions. "Did you sleep any?" Emma finally asked, surprising him with her perceptiveness. "Enough," Thomas replied, stirring the cornmeal as it thickened. In truth, his few hours of uncomfortable dozing in Sarah's chair hardly qualified as rest, but the girl didn't need to concern herself with that. "Thank you," she said softly, "for staying, for not leaving me alone." Thomas nodded once, acknowledging her gratitude without meeting her eyes. He served the food, setting a plate before her and taking the opposite chair. Emma stared at the simple meal as if it were a feast, then looked up at him questioningly. "Go ahead," he encouraged, "but eat slow. Your stomach needs to remember how." She needed no further prompting, though she did follow his advice, taking small, measured bites. Thomas ate mechanically, more out of habit than hunger, watching as color continued to return to her face with each mouthful. "We need to talk about what happens next," he said when they had both finished eating. Emma's hand tightened on her spoon. "Are you sending me away?" The naked fear in her voice caught Thomas off guard. "Not today," he assured her. "You need more. A rest, proper clothes." He gestured at her tattered dress. "But eventually we'll need to find your people. Family back east, maybe." "There's no one," Emma said flatly. "Papa was an only child. Mama's family disowned her for marrying a blacksmith. We were going to Colorado to start fresh." Thomas considered this. It wasn't unusual for families heading west to have burned bridges. Behind them, seeking new beginnings far from whatever troubles or disappointments they'd left behind. If Emma was telling the truth, and he had no reason to doubt her, finding relatives willing to take her in might prove challenging. "There's still proper authorities," he said. "Sheriff in Council Grove might know of a suitable family, maybe the church ladies." Emma's face drained of what little color she'd regained. "Please," she whispered, "don't send me to strangers." "I'm a stranger," Thomas pointed out gently. "You saved me," she countered. "You didn't have to, but you did. You could have left me in that field or done worse." Her voice faltered. "But you gave me water and food and a safe place to sleep. You stayed when I was afraid." Thomas sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Emma, I live alone for a reason. This isn't a proper place for a young girl. I have no experience with children except—" He stopped abruptly. "Except your daughter," Emma finished for him. "Sarah." Hearing his daughter's name on this stranger's lips sent a jolt through Thomas. He stood abruptly, gathering the plates with more force than necessary. "We'll discuss it later. Right now, you need more rest, and I have work to do." Emma looked like she wanted to argue, but thought better of it. "Can I help? With anything? I'm stronger today." Thomas nearly refused outright, but something in her expression stopped him. A desperate need to be useful, to focus on something besides her own trauma. He recognized it from his own experiences after the war, after losing Rebecca and Sarah. Work had been his salvation, the endless physical demands of the ranch forcing him to keep moving when all he'd wanted was to lie down and never rise again. "There's eggs to collect," he said finally. "Chickens are out back. Coop's the small building with the red door." Emma nodded eagerly, clearly relieved to have a task. "I know about chickens. We had 6 back home in Ohio." Thomas watched her make her way somewhat unsteadily out the back door, struck by how quickly children could bounce back from physical hardship, even as the emotional wounds might never fully heal. He finished cleaning up from breakfast, then headed to the barn, where endless repairs awaited his attention. The day settled into an uneasy rhythm. Thomas split his time between the necessary chores and keeping an eye on Emma, who seemed determined to prove her usefulness despite her still weakened state. After collecting the eggs, she asked if she could tidy the kitchen. He found her later, attempting to sweep the porch, the broom nearly as tall as she was, her face set in stubborn determination despite the obvious fatigue in her movements. "That's enough for today," he told her around midday, gently taking the broom from her hands. "You need to pace yourself." Emma reluctantly allowed herself to be led back inside. Thomas made a simple lunch of cold biscuits, left from the previous day, and some dried apple slices. As they ate, he noticed her eyelids growing heavy despite her clear attempts to stay alert. "Rest," he urged, nodding toward Sarah's room. "No shame in it, been through a hell of a time." Emma didn't argue, which told Thomas just how exhausted she truly was. She disappeared into the bedroom, and he returned to his work, finding a strange comfort in the knowledge that the house wasn't empty for once, that someone else's breathing filled the spaces Rebecca and Sarah had left vacant. It was late afternoon, when the sound of approaching horses pulled Thomas from his work repairing a section of fence. He straightened, one hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip as he scanned the horizon. 2 riders approached from the east, moving at an unhurried pace that suggested neither threat nor urgency. As they drew closer, Thomas recognized the lead rider, Jacob Miller, owner of the largest spread in the county, and a man Thomas had done business with occasionally, selling him cattle when his own herd grew beyond what he could manage alone. Behind him rode one of his ranch hands, a young man whose name Thomas couldn't recall. "Ward," Miller called in greeting as they drew rein before him. "Thought we might find you out working despite this ungodly heat." Thomas nodded in acknowledgement. "Miller, something I can help you with?" Miller dismounted, a heavy-set man in his 50s with a prosperous belly and a face weathered by decades under the Kansas sun. "Passing through on our way back from Council Grove. Thought you should know there's talk of Indian trouble to the west." He removed his hat, wiping sweat from his brow with a bandana. "Army patrol found the remains of a small wagon train about 40 miles from here. 5 families by the look of it, all massacred." Thomas felt his blood run cold. "When?" "Few days ago, they reckon. Buzzards led them to it." Miller shook his head grimly. "Ugly business. They're saying it was Cheyenne. though how they can tell one set of savages from another is beyond me. Thomas kept his face carefully neutral. Miller's views on the native tribes were well known and not worth arguing over. "Survivors?" he asked, though he already knew the answer, or at least part of it. "None that they found," Miller replied. "Though there's signs someone might have escaped into the brush. Army's looking, but—" He shrugged, the gesture conveying the unlikelihood of finding anyone alive after days in the open during this heat wave. Thomas weighed his next words carefully. Emma's presence was not something he wanted widely known, not until he'd decided what to do. At the same time, if the army was searching for survivors, they might have information about her family or other relatives. "Terrible thing," he said noncommittally. "Families heading to Colorado?" Miller nodded. "That's the thought. Typical story. Easterners with stars in their eyes about making their fortune out west, no idea what they're getting into. Shouldn't be allowed to travel in such small groups, especially with women and children." He replaced his hat. "Anyway, thought you should know. Might want to keep your rifle handy, though they think the war parties move further west." "Appreciate the warning," Thomas said. Miller hesitated, seeming to debate saying more. "Been meaning to ask. McPherson's looking to sell that north section that borders your land. Good grazing, decent water access. Thought you might be interested." "Not in a position to expand right now," Thomas replied. The truth was, even if he'd had the money, he had no desire for more land, more cattle, more responsibility. What he had was challenging enough for one man to manage. Miller shrugged. "Fair enough. Just thought I'd mention it. I'll likely pick it up myself if no one else does." He remounted his horse. "Take care, Ward. Keep an eye out." Thomas watched them ride off, his mind churning. The massacre Emma had described was real. Not that he'd doubted her, but hearing it confirmed made the situation more concrete. If the army was involved, there would be official reports, perhaps inquiries about any family the victims might have had back east. He returned to the house, finding Emma awake and sitting on the porch steps, her face turned toward the setting sun. She looked up as he approached, something in his expression alerting her that something had changed. "What is it?" she asked, her voice small. Thomas sat beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "Had visitors. Neighbor named Miller. They've found the wagon train." Emma's face drained of color, her hands clutching at the worn fabric of her dress. Did they bury them?" "The army's there," Thomas said, not addressing the question directly. He had seen enough aftermath of Indian attacks to know that proper burial wasn't always possible, especially days after the fact in summer. Heat. "They're looking for survivors." "There aren't any," Emma whispered. "Just me, and I ran away." "You survived," Thomas corrected. "Just like I told you last night. That took courage." Emma stared down at her hands. "What happens now?" "Will they come looking for me? Eventually," Thomas acknowledged. "Though they don't know yet that anyone survived." The implication hung in the air between them. He could report Emma's presence, alert the authorities that one child had escaped the massacre. It would be the proper thing to do, the responsible action any law-abiding citizen would take. "Please," Emma said, looking up at him with eyes too old for her young face. "Not yet. I can't talk about it all again. Not to strangers, not yet." Thomas studied her, seeing the fragility beneath her determination. He thought of the nightmares that still plagued him occasionally over a decade after Gettysburg, the way certain sounds or smells could hurl him back into the midst of the carnage. He thought of how he'd retreated to this isolated ranch after Rebecca and Sarah died, unable to bear the well-meaning condolences and pitying looks from neighbors. "No one knows you're here," he said finally. "No need to tell them just yet. But eventually, Emma, the truth will need to come out. You understand that?" She nodded, relief washing over her features. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll earn my keep." I promise I can cook and clean and learn whatever you need me to do around here. We'll sort all that out later, Thomas said, uncomfortable with the intensity of her gratitude. For now, you focus on getting your strength back. Got some stew. Warming for dinner. Think you can manage that? As the sun sank below the horizon, painting the vast Kansas sky in shades of orange and purple, Thomas found himself studying the girl as she ate her stew with the careful deliberation of someone who had nearly starved. The day's revelations had complicated matters. The authorities would eventually expand their search, looking for remains or survivors across a wider area. Someone would come asking questions. What would he tell them when they did? That he'd harbored a traumatized orphan without reporting her existence? His motivations might be innocent, but he'd lived long enough to know how such situations could be misinterpreted, especially for a man alone. Yet the thought of handing Emma over to strangers, forcing her to relive her trauma for official reports before she was ready, sat poorly with him. Watching her methodically break a biscuit into small pieces to soak up the last of her stew, Thomas made a decision. He would give her time, a few days, perhaps a week, to regain her strength and some measure of equilibrium before making any official report. She deserved that much. This child who had witnessed horrors no one should have to endure, and somehow found the courage to keep moving forward. "Emma," he said, causing her to look up from her plate, "tomorrow we'll ride into town. Get you some proper clothes, supplies. Can't have you wearing that tattered dress much longer." Her eyes widened. "Town? But what if someone asks who I am?" "My niece from back east," Thomas replied, the lie coming more easily than expected. "Come to stay a while after losing your parents. Not so far from the truth, and simple stories are easiest to remember." Emma considered this, then nodded slowly. "Niece?" she repeated, testing the word. "What was your wife's name?" she asked suddenly. "If I'm your niece, I should know." "Rebecca," Thomas said, the name feeling strange on his tongue after so long avoiding it. "She was Rebecca Ward, formerly Rebecca Simmons, before we married." "And Sarah was your only child," Emma continued, her practical approach to building their fiction catching Thomas by surprise. "Yes," he said, a familiar ache accompanying the word. "She would have been about your age now." Emma absorbed this information with solemn attention. "I'm sorry," she said again, the simple phrase somehow weightier than when she'd first offered it. Thomas nodded once in acknowledgement. "Finish your supper," he said, deflecting from the emotional terrain that felt increasingly treacherous. "Got an early start tomorrow if we're to make town and back before dark." As Emma obeyed, Thomas found himself wondering at the ease with which he'd decided to perpetuate this deception, however temporary. It wasn't like him to skirt the law or proper procedures. Yet something about Emma's silent suffering, the dignity with which she bore her devastating losses, had awakened a protective instinct he'd thought long buried with his family. Perhaps, he reflected, as darkness settled fully over the prairie, it was simply that seeing her struggle reminded him of his own journey through grief, the raw, bleeding wound of initial loss, gradually forming a scar that, while permanent, eventually allowed one to function again. Or perhaps, after 3 years of speaking to no one but occasional traders and neighbors, the sound of another voice in his home had reminded him of what it meant to be connected to another human being. Whatever the reason, Thomas Ward, who had prided himself on his solitude and self-sufficiency since burying his wife and daughter, found himself reluctantly adjusting to the presence of a traumatized child whom fate had deposited quite literally on his doorstep. Tomorrow would bring new complications, the trip to town, the prospect of curious questions from people who knew him only as the taciturn rancher who avoided social contact. But for tonight, it was enough that Emma was safe, fed, and beginning to heal under his roof. As Thomas banked the kitchen fire for the night, he caught sight of Emma standing in the doorway of Sarah's room, her thin silhouette outlined against the faint lamplight behind her. "Will you—" she began, then stopped, clearly struggling with herself. "Never mind. Good night, Mr. Ward. Thank you for supper." Thomas recognized the unasked question, the same one from the previous night, the request for reassurance that she wouldn't be alone with her nightmares. Something in his chest tightened at her attempt at brave independence, the way she straightened her narrow shoulders as if preparing to face the darkness alone. "I'll be right out here," he said, gesturing to the rocking chair by the fireplace. "If you need anything in the night." The relief that flashed across her face confirmed his guess. "Thank you," she whispered, disappearing back into the bedroom. Thomas settled into the rocking chair, his rifle propped beside him more from habit than any expectation of danger. Outside, the familiar sounds of the prairie night, coyotes calling, the wind rustling through the cornfield, an occasional lowing from the cattle in their distant pasture, created a symphony he normally found soothing. Tonight, his thoughts were too occupied with what tomorrow might bring to find comfort in the familiar cadence of the land. As he drifted toward an uneasy sleep, Thomas found himself wondering what Rebecca would think of the strange twist his solitary existence had taken. He could almost hear her gentle laughter, could almost see the knowing look in her eyes. She had always believed that people came into each other's lives for a reason, that apparent coincidence often masked deeper purpose. "Don't read too much into it, Beck," he murmured to the empty room, "just doing what anyone decent would do." But as sleep finally claimed him, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that perhaps, just perhaps, Emma Sullivan had been sent to his lonely ranch for reasons that went beyond simple chance, a survivor who needed the particular understanding of a man well acquainted with loss, and a solitary rancher who needed reminding that life continued even after everything seemed to end. The trip to town proved more daunting than Emma had anticipated. Thomas had found one of Sarah's old dresses for her, a simple blue cotton garment that hung loose on Emma's thinner frame, but was infinitely better than her tattered clothes. He'd helped her braid her hair, his large fingers surprisingly gentle. As he worked through the tangles, the intimate gesture revealing more about his life as a father than any words could have. Now she sat beside him on the wagon bench, clutching the edge with white knuckles as the rutted trail jolted them mercilessly. Each mile took them further from the safety of Thomas's isolated ranch and closer to a world of questions she wasn't prepared to answer. "Remember," Thomas said as the first buildings of Council Grove appeared on the horizon, "you're my niece from back east. Parents passed from fever. Come to stay a while." Emma nodded, rehearsing the story in her mind. "My name is Emma Ward," she recited quietly. "My father was your brother James. Mother was Catherine. Both died of fever in Pennsylvania." Thomas glanced at her with something like approval. "Good memory, keep it simple. Answer questions direct, but don't volunteer more than asked." The town itself was smaller than Emma had expected. A single main street, lined with false-fronted buildings, a church steeple rising at one end, the steady rhythm of a blacksmith's hammer ringing from somewhere nearby. The sound made her flinch, too reminiscent of her father's workshop back in Ohio. Thomas noticed her reaction. "We'll make this quick," he promised. "General store first for necessities. Then maybe the cafe for a hot meal before heading back." As they pulled up in front of Jones General Merchandise, Emma felt the weight of curious stares. Thomas Ward was evidently not a man often seen in the company of a young girl. She straightened her shoulders, determined not to embarrass him or draw unwanted attention. The store's interior was dim after the bright sunshine, shelves packed with goods ranging from tools to fabrics to canned foods. A middle-aged woman with graying hair pulled into a severe bun looked up from her ledger, surprise evident on her face. "Mr. Ward," she said, setting aside her pencil. "Twice in 1 month. Must be some kind of record. Thomas nodded stiffly. Mrs. Jones, need some supplies, and some things for my niece here. He gestured toward Emma, who tried to look appropriately solemn for a recently orphaned child. Emma, this is Mrs. Jones, runs the store with her husband. Mrs. Jones's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. Niece? Didn't know you had family. Mr. Ward. Brother's girl from back east, Thomas replied, the lie sounding perfectly natural. Parents passed. She's come to stay with me for a spell. Mrs. Jones's expression softened as she looked at Emma. I'm sorry for your loss, child. Must be difficult, coming all this way to a strange place. Emma nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The woman's sympathy, though genuine, made her painfully aware of her deception and the real losses she wasn't allowed to grieve openly. Thomas pulled a list from his pocket, changing the subject. Need these items, plus whatever appropriate clothes you have for a girl her age. Growing fast, so room. To spare would be wise. Mrs. Jones took the list, scanning it briefly. Of course, let me show you what we have. The next hour passed in a blur of fabrics and measurements, practical discussions of what a young girl on a ranch might need. Emma stood obediently as Mrs. Jones held up dresses and aprons against her frame, nodding or shaking her head when asked her preference. By the end, they had selected 2 everyday dresses, a slightly finer one for Sundays, undergarments, a nightgown, sturdy boots, and a straw. Had to protect against the relentless Kansas sun. Growing girl needs proper feeding, Mrs. Jones commented as she wrapped their purchases. She's thin as a rail, Mr. Ward. Journey was hard on her, Thomas replied, a statement that contained more truth than fiction. She'll fill out with good cooking. Speaking of which, Mrs. Jones said, lowering her voice, you might consider hiring help, Mr. Ward. Not proper for a man alone to be raising a young lady. Mrs. Peterson over by the church takes in laundry. Might be willing to come by a few days a week, help with woman things. Emma saw Thomas stiffen slightly at the suggestion. We'll manage, he said shortly, counting out money for their purchases. Mrs. Jones pursed her lips, but didn't press the issue. Well, if you change your mind, or if little Miss Emma here needs anything at all, you send word. We look after our own in Council Grove. Outside, their wagon now loaded with supplies, Thomas seemed to be debating whether to proceed with his plan to visit the cafe. Emma, sensing his discomfort with further social interaction, spoke up. Could we just head back? She asked quietly. I'm tired, and we have food at home. The relief on Thomas's face was evident, though he tried to hide it. You sure? Thought. You might enjoy a proper cooked meal, Emma shook her head. I'd rather go back. People stare. This was true enough. Throughout their time in the store, customers had come and gone, each one casting curious glances at the notorious recluse Thomas Ward and his unexpected ward. Questions had been politely phrased but pointed nonetheless, and Emma had felt the strain of maintaining their fabrication. Thomas needed no further convincing. They were halfway out of town when a voice called out, halting their progress. Ward, hold up a minute. Emma turned to see a man in a dusty uniform riding toward them, the silver star on his chest identifying him as the local sheriff. Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop, his expression carefully neutral. Sheriff Davis, he acknowledged as the man drew alongside. Something wrong? Sheriff Davis, a lean man with a salt-and-pepper mustache and shrewd eyes, looked from Thomas to Emma and back again. Heard you were in town with company. Thought I'd say hello. My niece, Thomas supplied before the question could be asked. Emma Ward from Pennsylvania, Sheriff Davis. Emma managed a polite nod, her heart hammering against her ribs. If anyone would know about the massacre, it would be the local law enforcement. Pleasure, Miss Ward, the sheriff said, tipping his hat. Sorry circumstances bringing you out here, from what I gather. Mrs. Jones mentioned you lost your folks. Yes, sir, Emma replied softly. Fever. The sheriff made a sympathetic noise. Tough break. Lucky to have family to take you in. His gaze shifted back to Thomas. Didn't know you had a brother back east, Ward. Thomas met the sheriff's eyes, steadily. Not much cause to discuss family matters in our previous dealings, Sheriff. True enough, Davis conceded. Then, as if making a decision, he added, might want to keep close to home for a spell, Ward. Indian trouble brewing. Army's investigating a massacre about 40 miles west of here. Nasty business. So I heard, Thomas replied evenly. Mila rode by yesterday with the news. The sheriff nodded. Lieutenant Carswell's leading the investigation. Says they found signs suggesting at least one person might have escaped the attack. They're widening the search area. Emma felt Thomas tense beside her, though his face betrayed nothing. Hope they find whoever it is, he said. Can't imagine surviving something like that alone out there, especially if it's a woman or child. Sheriff Davis studied Thomas for a moment too long, making Emma wonder if their deception was more transparent than they'd thought. But then he merely shrugged. Well, just wanted to give you the warning. Take care heading back, and welcome to Kansas, Miss Ward, though I'm sorry for the circumstances. As they continued their journey home, Emma noticed Thomas checking over his shoulder more than once, as if concerned they might be followed. The silence between them stretched uncomfortably until they were well beyond the town limits. The sheriff suspects something, Emma finally said, giving voice to her fears. Thomas considered this, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Davis is a good lawman, observant, but he has no reason to connect you to that wagon train. Not yet. What if the army comes looking? What if they find tracks or something leading to your property? Been 3 days of high winds and that dust storm yesterday, Thomas replied. Trails long gone, if there ever was one clear enough to follow. Despite his reassurance, Emma noticed Thomas had quickened the horse's pace, as if eager to return to the isolation and relative safety of his ranch. She shared the sentiment, finding the brief exposure to other people and their curiosity more exhausting than she'd anticipated. Back at the ranch, Thomas unloaded their supplies while Emma took her new clothes to Sarah's room. Her room now, she supposed, at least temporarily. She ran her fingers over the simple fabrics, guilt mingling with gratitude. Thomas had spent his hard-earned money on her. A stranger he'd found half dead in his field had perpetuated a lie to protect her from uncomfortable questions. Why? She posed this question to him that evening as they sat on the porch after supper, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance over the prairie grasses. Why are you helping me like this? Lying to people you know, buying me things, letting me stay. You don't owe me anything. Thomas was silent for so long, Emma thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice was low, reflective. After Gettysburg, he began, surprising her with the reference to his military service. I was wounded. Not this. He gestured to the scar on his face. That came later. Took a bullet in the shoulder, bayonet to the leg. Lay in a field hospital more dead than alive for weeks. He paused, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the physical landscape. Army surgeon wanted to take the arm. Said it was too far gone to save. Gangrene setting in. There was a nurse there. Older woman. Never knew her name. She argued with him, said I was too young to lose the arm if there was any chance to save it. Stayed by my cot for 3 days, changing poultices, draining the wound, keeping the fever down. Thomas flexed his left hand unconsciously. Saved the arm. Saved my life, truth be told. Never had a chance to thank her proper. She was gone when I came fully back to myself. Moved to another field hospital farther north. He turned to look at Emma directly. Sometimes we get chances to return debts we didn't even know we owed. Maybe this is mine. The simple explanation, devoid of sentimentality but profound in its honesty, brought unexpected tears to Emma's eyes. It's not the same, she protested softly. That was war. She was doing her duty. Going beyond duty, Thomas corrected. She could have let the surgeon take the easier path. No one would have faulted her. Instead, she fought for a stranger because she thought it was right. He looked back toward the darkening prairie. Been too long since I did something simply because it was right, not just because it was necessary. Emma digested this, understanding that she was witnessing a rare moment of openness from a man who had clearly spent years building walls around himself. "Thank you," she said finally, inadequate words for the depth of her gratitude. Thomas merely nodded. The moment of vulnerability passed. "Best get some rest. Tomorrow we start establishing routines. Can't have you underfoot all day with nothing productive to do." Despite the gruffness of his tone, Emma recognized the statement for what it was, not a complaint about her presence, but an acknowledgement that she would be staying, at least for now. The realization brought a warmth to her chest that had nothing to do with the summer evening's lingering heat. That night, for the first time since finding her in the cornfield, Thomas did not sit guard in her room as she fell asleep. Instead, he bid her good night at her door, awkward but resolute in this small step toward normalcy. "Call if you need anything," he said. "I'm just down the hall." Emma lay in Sarah's bed, hers now, she supposed, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and settlings of the house, the distant lowing of cattle, the endless chirping of crickets. The darkness felt less threatening than it had the previous nights. The memories of the massacre still present, but somehow held at bay by the simple knowledge that she was safe, that beyond her door was someone who, for reasons of his own, had chosen to protect her. Over the next few days, they settled into a tentative rhythm. Thomas showed her simple ranch tasks appropriate for her age and strength, gathering eggs, feeding the chickens, helping in the small vegetable garden behind. The house that had clearly suffered from neglect. Emma approached each task with determination, eager to prove her usefulness and justify her presence. For his part, Thomas seemed both discomfited and oddly rejuvenated by having someone else in his space. He would forget she was there, muttering to himself, as had become his habit during years of solitude, then start slightly upon seeing her. Yet he also began taking more care with meals, ensuring there was enough for two, even making an effort to prepare foods a child might find appealing. One morning, Emma woke to find him constructing a small shelf in her room. "For your things," he explained gruffly when she questioned him. "Can't have everything piled on the floor." These small gestures of permanence both comforted and concerned Emma. While part of her yearned desperately for stability after the trauma she'd endured, another part recognized the precariousness of their situation. The lie they'd told in town couldn't hold forever. Eventually, someone would connect the massacre's timing with her sudden appearance at Thomas's ranch. Questions would be asked that couldn't be easily answered. These worries surfaced most strongly at night, when the protective barriers of daylight activity fell away. Despite her best efforts, Emma often woke gasping from nightmares, the screams of her family echoing in her ears, the sight of her mother falling while protecting little James replaying in vivid detail. On the third such night, Thomas appeared in her doorway, awakened by her cries. "Bad one?" he asked simply, lighting the small lamp on her bedside table. Emma nodded, ashamed of her weakness, but unable to stop the trembling that had overtaken her body. Without comment, Thomas disappeared, returning moments later with a steaming mug that he placed in her hands. "Warm milk with honey," he explained. "Sarah used to have nightmares too, after her mother died." Emma sipped the sweet liquid, its warmth spreading through her chest. "Did they ever stop?" The bad dreams? Thomas settled into the chair beside her bed, his face half in shadow. Got less frequent. Never stopped entirely. A pause. Then, with quiet honesty, still have my own sometimes. About the war. About losing them. The admission startled Emma, this acknowledgement that even adults, even someone as seemingly solid and unshakable as Thomas Ward, carried their own night terrors. What do you do when they come? Thomas considered the question. Remember, I survived. That surviving means something, even when it doesn't feel like it does. He glanced at her, then away. Figure out what you're still here to do. What if I don't know? Emma asked, her voice small. You will, Thomas said with surprising certainty. Not right away, takes time. But one morning you'll wake up and find you're thinking more about today than yesterday. That's when you'll start to figure it out. The simple wisdom of his words settled over Emma like a blanket. She finished her milk in contemplative silence, the nightmare's grip gradually loosening. Try to sleep now, Thomas said, rising to leave. Tomorrow's soon enough for worrying. But tomorrow brought a new worry, one neither of them had anticipated. Emma was feeding the chickens when she heard the distant sound of approaching horses. Doom, multiple riders moving at a purposeful pace. She froze. Feed bucket clutched to her chest as Thomas emerged from the barn, his face set in grim lines. Inside, he ordered quietly. Now. Who is it? Emma asked, already moving toward the house. Army patrol, Thomas replied, his eyes fixed on the horizon where dust clouds marked the approaching riders. 6 men at least, lieutenant at the front. Emma felt her heart stutter with fear. They're looking for survivors from the wagon train. Thomas nodded once, his jaw tight. Get inside, stay quiet, let me handle this. As Emma slipped into the house, finding a position at the window where she could see without being easily spotted, Thomas moved to the water trough, deliberately washing his hands and face as if preparing to greet visitors. His rifle leaned against the porch post, close enough to reach if needed, but not in his hands in a way that might appear threatening. The patrol arrived in a cloud of dust, horses lathered from hard riding in the summer heat. At their head rode a young officer in a crisply maintained uniform despite the harsh conditions, his back ramrod straight in the saddle. Thomas Ward? The lieutenant called, bringing his mount to a halt. Thomas straightened, drying his hands on. A rag with deliberate casualness. That's right. Something I can help you with, Lieutenant. Carswell. Lieutenant James Carswell, 7th Cavalry. The officer dismounted, his movements precise. We're investigating an Indian attack on a wagon train about 40 miles west of here. 5 families massacred, no survivors found at the scene. Emma held her breath, pressing back against the wall beside the window. From her position she could see Thomas's face remain impassive, giving nothing away. Heard about that, he acknowledged. Terrible business. But not sure how I can help you, Lieutenant. I've been right here tending my cattle. Lieutenant Carswell's eyes narrowed slightly. We found tracks, Mr. Ward. A child or small woman, we believe, heading east from the massacre site. Trails mostly. Are gone now, but what we could follow led in this general direction. Thomas spread his hands in a gesture of openness. As you can see, Lieutenant, it's just me here. Been just me for 3 years now since I lost my wife and daughter to consumption. The lieutenant glanced toward the house, his gaze passing over the window where Emma hid. Mind if we look around, Mr. Ward? Standard procedure in our investigation. Emma's heart pounded so loudly she was certain they must hear it even at this distance. All it would take was one quick search of the house to discover her presence. Her new clothes, the evidence of a child clearly living there. Thomas's lie would be exposed, and whatever consequences came with it would fall on his head as well as hers. Through the window, she saw Thomas's shoulders tense almost imperceptibly, before he gave a single short nod. "Help yourself, Lieutenant, though I'd appreciate if your men would mind the garden my wife planted," still trying to keep it going in her memory. As the soldiers began to dismount, Emma made her decision. Before she could reconsider, she pushed open the front door and stepped onto the porch, her chin lifted in what she hoped appeared as innocent confusion rather than terror. "Uncle Thomas," she called, forcing her voice to remain steady, "are we having visitors for dinner?" Lieutenant Carswell's head snapped toward the porch, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holstered pistol. The other soldiers paused. In their dismounting, watching the unexpected development with wary attention, Emma felt Thomas's momentary shock before he masterfully composed himself, moving toward her with a naturalness that belied the tension coiling beneath his calm exterior. "Emma," he said, placing a protective hand on her shoulder, "these men are from the army, just asking some questions about troubles out west." He turned to the lieutenant, whose suspicious expression had transformed into curiosity. "My niece," Thomas explained, "arrived last week from Pennsylvania. Her parents, my brother and his wife, passed from fever." Emma forced a shy smile, dropping her gaze to the weathered porch boards as she'd seen other girls do when introduced to strangers. Inside, her heart threatened to burst from her chest, but outwardly she presented the perfect picture of a demure, slightly intimidated child meeting uniformed men. Lieutenant Carswell's rigid posture relaxed marginally. "I wasn't aware you had family staying with you, Mr. Ward." "Recent development," Thomas replied. "Emma, why don't you go finish your chores while I speak with the lieutenant?" Emma nodded obediently, but Carswell held up a hand. "Actually, I'd like to speak with the young lady as well, if you don't mind." His tone made it clear this wasn't truly a request. Children often notice things adults overlook. Thomas's fingers tightened slightly on Emma's shoulder before he caught himself. "What exactly are you looking for, Lieutenant?" Carswell removed his hat, revealing sweat-dampened hair cropped close to his skull. "As I mentioned, we're investigating the Wagon train massacre. We believe at least one person escaped the attack. We found tracks heading eastward, small footprints, most likely a child or small woman. Given your ranch's location, you thought they might have passed through here," Thomas finished for him. "Or sought help," Carswell added, his eyes studying Emma with uncomfortable intensity. Emma felt a chill despite the summer heat. She had practiced the story of being Thomas's niece, but detailed questions about her supposed journey from Pennsylvania or her fictional parents might quickly expose the gaps in their hastily constructed narrative. Thomas seemed to sense her distress. "Emma arrived by stagecoach to Council Grove," he said firmly. "I collected her there last week. She's been here on the ranch since then, helping me with chores. Haven't seen any strangers passing through, have we, Emma?" Emma shook her head. "No, sir." The lieutenant's gaze remained fixed on her. "You came all the way from Pennsylvania by yourself, Miss Ward? That's quite a journey for a young lady." "The stage company had a woman who escorts children traveling alone," Emma replied, the lie coming more easily than she'd expected. "Mrs. Hollister. She was very kind." "I see." Carswell turned back to Thomas. "Mind if my men water their horses, Mr. Ward? Been a long ride in this heat." Thomas nodded toward the trough. "Help yourselves. Emma, fetch some drinking water for the lieutenant and his men." Emma recognized the instruction for what it was, a way to remove her from Carswell's scrutiny while maintaining the appearance of frontier hospitality. She hurried inside, but positioned herself near the open window where she could hear the conversation continue. "Smart girl," Carswell commented. "How old is she?" 12, Thomas replied. "Nearly 13. Got her mother's. Quick mind. Must be a comfort, having family around after being alone so long. Town talks about how you've kept to yourself since losing your wife and child." Emma could hear the subtle probing in the lieutenant's tone, the suggestion that Thomas's sudden acquisition of a niece was suspiciously convenient. "Never had much need for company," Thomas said evenly. "Ran the ranch fine on my own. But when word came about James and Catherine passing, couldn't leave their daughter with strangers." Emma filled a water pitcher, impressed by Thomas's calm elaboration of their fiction. He spoke with just enough detail to sound authentic without overcomplicating the lie. "Tragic timing," Carswell remarked. "Your niece arriving just as this massacre occurs nearby. World's full of tragedy, Lieutenant, as I'm sure you've seen in your service." Emma returned with the water and tin cups, offering them first to the lieutenant, then to the other soldiers who had gathered near the porch. She kept her eyes downcast, playing the role of the shy, well-mannered girl. "Thank you, Miss Ward," Carswell said, studying her over the rim of his cup as he drank. "Tell me, have you seen any Indians since arriving in Kansas?" Emma almost froze, the innocent question striking too close to her actual trauma. She looked to Thomas, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. "No, sir," she managed. "Uncle Thomas says they mostly stay west of here now." "Indeed," Carswell agreed, "though this renegade band has proven unpredictable. Attacking a wagon train in broad daylight shows unusual boldness." He set down his cup. "If you don't mind, Mr. Ward, I'd still like my men to have a quick look around. Standard procedure." Thomas spread his hands in a gesture of accommodation. "Nothing to hide here, Lieutenant, though I'd appreciate if they'd mind trampling Rebecca's flowers. Been trying to keep her garden going since she passed." Thomas raised an eyebrow at this piece of motherly wisdom but didn't comment on it. "Still, we need to be more careful, need to make sure our story holds up to scrutiny." "You think they'll come back?" "Maybe not the army, but Sheriff Davis might. He and Carswell will talk, compare notes. Davis knows most everyone around here, including who does and doesn't have family back east." The reality of their precarious situation settled over Emma, like a weight. "What do we do?" Thomas was silent for a long moment, staring out at his land with a contemplative expression. "Need to make it more convincing." "Your being here, I mean." He stood abruptly. "Come on, got chores to finish before sundown." The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity as they threw themselves into the ranch's routine, but Emma could sense Thomas's preoccupation. He worked mechanically, his mind clearly elsewhere, considering options and discarding them. That evening after supper, as Emma washed the dishes, Thomas unfolded a sheet of paper at the kitchen table and began to write. "What's that?" Emma asked, drying her hands on her apron. "Letter," Thomas replied without looking up. "To my brother James in Pennsylvania, explaining that you arrived safely and are settling in well." Emma watched over his shoulder as his neat, precise handwriting filled the page. "But there is no James. Who's the letter really for?" Thomas glanced up. "Sheriff Davis, or whoever else gets curious enough to start asking harder questions." I don't understand. Creating evidence, Thomas explained, returning to his writing. If anyone doubts our story, I'll mention that I've been corresponding with your father's lawyer about your inheritance, handling paperwork for your parents' estate. This letter is the beginning of that paper trail. Later I'll write another from the lawyer to me. Emma marveled at the thoroughness of his thinking. You've done this before? Created false trails? A shadow crossed Thomas's face. During the war. Intelligence work for a time. Before I took the saber cut and got transferred to regular cavalry. He set down his pen. Not something I'm proud of, using those skills now, but sometimes survival requires compromise. The admission revealed yet another layer to this complicated man who had taken her in. Emma seated herself across from him. Is that why you're helping me? Because you understand about doing whatever it takes to survive? Thomas considered her question, his scarred face solemn in the lamplight. Partly, he conceded. But it's more than that. What happened to your family, to all those families in that wagon train? It wasn't right. Army will hunt down the warriors who did it, extract their vengeance, but that doesn't help you. And I remind you of Sarah, Emma added softly. Thomas's jaw tightened. For a moment she thought she'd overstepped, but then he nodded once, sharply. She'd be about your age now, had the same color hair, same determined way about her. He met Emma's gaze directly. But you're not her. I know that. You're Emma Sullivan, not Emma Ward. No matter what we tell the town, you had your own family, your own life before all this. The simple acknowledgement of her true identity, her real loss, brought unexpected tears to Emma's eyes. Since arriving at Thomas's ranch, they had focused so intently on practicalities, her physical recovery, establishing their cover story, evading difficult questions, that there had been little space to acknowledge the full weight of her grief. I miss them, she whispered, the words inadequate for the yawning emptiness inside her. Every day, even when I'm not thinking about them directly, they're there, like a shadow behind everything else. Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. Won't ever go away completely, not supposed to, but eventually it becomes something you carry rather than something that crushes you. He glanced toward the mantel where a small daguerreotype in a silver frame showed a woman with a serious expression and a young girl with light hair. Rebecca and Sarah are with me still, just differently than I'd hoped. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, united by their separate losses. Then Thomas returned to his letter, finishing it with a few more lines before folding it carefully and sealing it with a drop of candle wax. Tomorrow I'll ride into town, post this, and pick up a few more supplies we forgot, he said, rising from the table. You should stay here. Less chance of questions that way. Emma nodded, though the thought of being alone on the ranch made her uneasy after the army's visit. Do you think the lieutenant will come back? Not right away, Thomas replied. They'll continue searching westward first, following their theories about where a survivor might have gone. He studied her thoughtfully. Might be good for you to write down what actually happened, though. The attack, your journey here, details you remember. Why? Emma asked, alarmed by the suggestion of revisiting those traumatic memories. 2 reasons, Thomas said. First, writing it might help settle it in your mind. Nightmares often feed on the things we try hardest not to think about. He paused, something in his expression suggesting he spoke from experience. Second, someday you might need to tell the real story. Better to record the details while they're fresh, even if they're painful. Emma considered this advice. The thought of deliberately recalling the massacre made her stomach clench with anxiety, but she recognized the wisdom in his suggestion. "I'll try," she promised. The following morning, Thomas departed early for town, leaving Emma with a list of simple chores and strict instructions to stay close to the house. She watched him ride away with Commander, the familiar loneliness of abandonment threatening to engulf her despite knowing he would return by nightfall. To distract herself, Emma threw herself into the tasks he'd assigned, gathering eggs, weeding the vegetable garden, sweeping the floors. When these were completed, she found herself drawn to Sarah's bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines of volumes clearly cherished by Thomas's daughter. She selected one, Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, and settled on the porch to read. The story of the 4 March sisters struggling through hardship while their father was away at war absorbed her completely, providing a welcome escape from her own circumstances. She was so engrossed that she nearly missed the sound of approaching hoofbeats, a single rider coming at a measured pace from the direction of town. Emma's first instinct was to hide, but she checked herself, remembering their new strategy of openness. Instead, she marked her place in the book and stood, shading her eyes against the midday sun to identify the visitor. Sheriff Davis rode into view, his lean figure unmistakable even at a distance. Emma's heart pounded, but she forced herself to remain on the porch, the picture of a young girl innocently enjoying a quiet day at home. "Afternoon, Miss Ward," the sheriff called as he drew rein before the house. "Your uncle around?" "He rode into town, sir," Emma replied, keeping her voice steady, "for supplies and to post a letter. Said he'd be back before supper." Davis dismounted, tying his horse to the porch rail. "Mind if I water my horse and rest?" "A spell. Been riding fence lines since dawn, checking for signs of that Indian raiding party." "Of course," Emma said, stepping aside. "There's fresh water in the kitchen if you're thirsty too." Davis nodded his thanks and led his horse to the trough before joining her on the porch. He removed his hat, revealing sweat-dampened hair and a sunburned forehead. "Reading, I see," he commented, nodding toward the book she'd set aside. "Good story, that one. My sister used to read it to her girls." "I like Beth best," Emma offered, the innocent conversation helping calm her nerves. "She's kind to everyone." Davis smiled, the expression softening his weathered features. "Been meaning to ask how you're settling in, Miss Ward. Must be quite a change from Pennsylvania to Kansas." "Yes, sir," Emma agreed, careful to maintain her fictional background. "But Uncle Thomas has been very kind, and I like learning about the ranch." The sheriff studied her, his eyes thoughtful beneath the brim of his hat. "Lieutenant Carswell mentioned meeting you yesterday. Said you seemed a well-spoken young lady." Emma felt a chill despite the summer heat. "The soldiers were looking for survivors from that wagon train massacre," she said, deciding to address the subject directly. "It sounds terrible." "Awful business," Davis agreed, his expression grim. "Whole families wiped out. Army found signs that at least one person might have escaped, though, been looking high and low." "I hope they find them," Emma said quietly. "It must be frightening, being alone after something like that." Davis's gaze sharpened. "Interesting thing, though. According to Carswell, the tracks they found were about your size. Small feet, lightweight, child or small woman, they figured." Emma felt the blood drain from her face. She clutched the porch, railing for support, mind racing for a response that wouldn't betray her. "And the timing," Davis continued, watching her reaction closely. "You arriving just after the massacre. Town never hearing about Thomas having a niece before now. I don't understand, Emma managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Davis's expression softened unexpectedly. I think you do, child. And I think Thomas Ward, for all his solitary ways, couldn't turn away someone in desperate need. He sighed, removing his hat. Known Thomas since he came to these parts after the war. Not an unkind man, but not one to get involved in others' troubles either. Keeps to himself, does his work, pays his taxes. Type of man who minds his own business and expects others to do the same. He studied Emma's face. So when he suddenly shows up in town with a niece, no one's ever heard mentioned before, right after a massacre where a child might have escaped. Well, it makes a man wonder. Emma felt tears threatening, but forced them back. She wouldn't cry, not now. Are you going to tell the lieutenant? She asked, her voice small but steady. Davis considered her question, turning his hat in his hands. That depends, Miss Emma, on what really happened and why Thomas feels the need to hide it. The moment of decision had arrived sooner than either she or Thomas had anticipated. Emma took a deep breath, weighing her options. The sheriff was clearly suspicious, but his manner wasn't threatening. Perhaps the truth, or some version of it, was her only choice. I was there, she admitted, the words feeling strange after days of careful deception. At the wagon train, my family, everyone. She couldn't continue, the memories surging back with overwhelming force. Davis nodded, no surprise in his expression. I figured as much. How'd you end up here? Emma gathered herself, deciding that this much truth might preserve the rest of their fiction. I ran for days, I don't know how far. I found water on Mr. Ward's property and collapsed. He found me, brought me here, cared for me when I was sick from sun and thirst. And the niece story, Davis prompted. His idea, Emma said, protective of Thomas even now. He said people would ask questions, that it would be easier than explaining, than talking about what happened. Davis nodded slowly. And you went along with it because I can't. Emma struggled to articulate the overwhelming fear that seized her whenever she thought of reliving the massacre for official reports. I can't tell it over and over. I can't answer questions about every detail, about watching them die. I just can't. To her surprise, the sheriff's expression showed compassion rather than suspicion. I understand that, child. Seen enough tragedy in my years to know how it can lock a person's tongue. He sighed heavily. But you should know, the Army's determined to find any survivors. Part of their investigation. They won't stop looking. Please, Emma whispered, Mr. Ward has been kind to me. He's given me a safe place. Don't make me leave. Davis studied her, conflict evident in his face. Not looking to cause you more suffering, Miss Emma, but this situation, it's complicated. Thomas taking in a child with no legal right, no proper channels, could be seen as kidnapping in some lights. He saved me, Emma protested. I'd have died out there if he hadn't found me. I believe you, Davis assured her. But the law has its own way of seeing things, and there's the matter of your family's remains, their possessions, might be inheritance matters to settle. Emma hadn't considered this aspect, that her parents' deaths, however tragic, would necessitate legal proceedings regarding whatever meager property they had left behind. The thought of strangers pouring through the remnants of her family's lives made her stomach turn. What will you do? She asked, meeting the sheriff's gaze directly. Davis replaced his hat, his decision apparently made. Going to have a conversation with Thomas when he returns. See what he has to say about all this. He stood, preparing to leave. "In the meantime, you stay put. No more running. Understood? Whatever happens next, we'll figure it out proper-like." Emma nodded, relief and anxiety warring within her. The sheriff hadn't immediately threatened to remove her from Thomas's care, but his mention of legal complications suggested rough waters ahead. "Thank you," she said simply, not entirely sure what she was thanking him for, but sensing that Davis's approach to their situation could have been far more rigid, far less compassionate. "Don't thank me yet," the sheriff cautioned, mounting his horse. "Still got a mess to untangle here, but I will say this, Thomas Ward's been alone too long. Maybe having someone to look after isn't the worst thing that could happen to him. Legal complications aside." With that enigmatic statement, Sheriff Davis tipped his hat and rode away, leaving Emma standing on the porch, the forgotten book still beside her, wondering if she had just made a terrible mistake or taken the first step toward a more honest future. Thomas returned just before sunset, his wagon loaded with supplies from town. Emma watched anxiously from the porch as he approached, dreading the conversation that awaited him. The sheriff hadn't said when he would return to speak with Thomas, but Emma suspected it wouldn't be long. Thomas noticed her tense posture immediately. He pulled the wagon to a halt, scanning the property with a quick, experienced glance. "What happened?" he asked, not bothering with greetings. "Sheriff Davis was here," Emma replied, her voice barely above a whisper despite the fact that they were alone. "He knows, Thomas. About me, about the wagon train. He figured it out." Thomas's expression hardened, but he didn't seem entirely surprised. "Tell me everything," he said, climbing down from the wagon. "Exactly what was said." Emma recounted the conversation as precisely as she could remember it, watching Thomas's face grow increasingly grave. When she finished, he remained silent for a long moment, absently stroking Commander's neck as he processed the information. "I had to tell him something," Emma said finally, unable to bear the silence any longer. "He already knew. The way he talked about the timing, about the tracks they found." "You did right," Thomas said, surprising her. "Davis is no fool. Trying to maintain the lie would only have made things worse." He began unhitching the horse from the wagon. "Did he say when he'd be back?" "Just that he wanted to talk to you, to see what you had to say about it all." Thomas nodded, his movements methodical despite the gravity of their situation. "Help me unload these supplies. We'll talk more inside." They worked together efficiently, carrying sacks of flour, sugar, coffee, and other necessities into the house. Thomas had purchased additional fabric for Emma, enough for 2 more dresses, as well as a pair of sturdy boots that would fit her growing feet better than Sarah's hand-me-downs. The thoughtfulness of these purchases, made when he must, have already been considering the precariousness of their situation, touched Emma deeply. Once everything was stored away, Thomas built up the fire in the kitchen stove and put on water for coffee. The familiar domestic routine felt strangely incongruous with the crisis looming over them. "Are we in trouble?" Emma finally asked, unable to contain her worry any longer. "Will they take me away?" Thomas settled into a chair at the kitchen table, gesturing for Emma to join him. "Not if I can help it," he said firmly, "but we need to be prepared. Davis is a fair man, but he's bound by law and duty. He said something about legal complications, about you not having a right to keep me here." Thomas nodded grimly. "That's the crux of it. In the eyes of the law, I have no claim to you, no blood relation, no legal guardianship. But you saved my life," Emma protested. "Doesn't that count for anything?" "It counts," Thomas assured her, But there are procedures, proper channels. Orphaned children don't simply get handed over to whoever happens to find them, especially not unmarried men living alone. The implications hit Emma with the force of a physical blow. "They'll send me to an orphanage," she whispered, horror rising within her at the thought of being confined among strangers, forced to relive her trauma over and over for curious administrators and pitying visitors. "Not necessarily," Thomas replied, though his tone lacked conviction. "There might be other options. Davis mentioned your family's remains, possessions. Could be relatives we don't know about, inheritance matters to settle." Emma shook her head vehemently. "I told you, there's no one. Papa was an only child. Mama's family disowned her when she married him. They wanted her to marry a banker's son, not a blacksmith." Thomas studied her, his scarred face solemn in the fading light. "What do you want, Emma? If you could choose." The question caught her off guard. In the chaos of survival and hiding, she hadn't allowed herself to think beyond the immediate future. "I want to stay here," she said simply, "with you." Something flickered across Thomas's face, surprise, uncertainty, perhaps even a trace of fear. "This isn't much of a life for a young girl," he said quietly. "Remote ranch. No other children. Nearby, no woman's influence, hard work and little comfort. It's more than I had wandering alone in the prairie," Emma countered, "and more than I'd have in some orphanage, or with strangers who only took me in out of duty or pity." She met his gaze directly. "You didn't have to help me. You chose to." "That means something." Thomas looked away, clearly uncomfortable with her earnestness. "Davis will be back tomorrow, most likely," he said, changing the subject. "We need to decide what to tell him. No more lies. He'd see through them. But we need a plan." "What kind of plan?" "A way forward that satisfies the law, but keeps you." Thomas paused, seemingly hesitant to voice what they both were thinking. "That keeps you here, if that's truly what you want." Hope flickered within Emma. "Can that happen? Legally, I mean." "Maybe," Thomas said cautiously. "There are provisions for guardianship in cases where no blood relatives can be found. It's not common, especially not for a single man, but it's not impossible." "Would you do that? Become my guardian officially?" Thomas was silent for a long moment, staring into the middle distance as if seeing possibilities unfold there. "It would mean changes," he said finally. "Scrutiny from the town, regular checks by the sheriff or a court representative to ensure your welfare. Would mean proper schooling for you either in town or with a tutor brought here. Appropriate clothing, social opportunities with other young people your age." "You make it sound like a burden," Emma said, hurt creeping into her voice, despite her efforts to hide it. Thomas's expression softened. "Not a burden, Emma. A responsibility. One I'm not sure I'm qualified for. I couldn't save Sarah. Couldn't protect her from the fever that took her and her mother. What makes me think I could do right by you?" The raw honesty of his doubt struck Emma deeply. She had sensed his grief, of course, had seen the evidence of it in the preserved bedroom and the carefully maintained garden. But this was the first time he had spoken so directly about his feelings of failure regarding his daughter's death. "You can't protect anyone from everything," she said softly. "Papa was the strongest man I knew, and he couldn't save Mama or James or himself from those warriors. But he tried. He shouted for us to run, gave us a chance while he faced them. That's all anyone can do, try their best with what they have." Thomas studied her, something like wonder crossing his weathered features. "You're wise beyond your years, Emma Sullivan." "Not wise," she countered, "just experienced now in things I wish I wasn't." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Get some rest," he said, rising from the table. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. Best face them with a clear head." That night, Emma lay awake long after the household had gone quiet, listening to the familiar sounds of the prairie night and wondering what the next day would bring. For the first time since the massacre, she allowed herself to imagine a future. Not just survival from one day to the next, but a life with continuity and purpose. A life here, on this remote Kansas ranch, with this solitary, honorable man who had saved her when he had every reason to turn away. The possibility both terrified and exhilarated her. To stay would mean accepting that her old life was truly gone, that her parents and brother were never coming back. Yet to leave would mean abandoning the only security she had found in the aftermath of unimaginable loss. Emma finally drifted into restless sleep, her dreams a confused jumble of memories. Her mother's hands braiding her hair for the journey west, her father's strong arms lifting her into their wagon, little James's laughter as he chased butterflies at their last campsite. These peaceful images dissolved into the horror of the attack, screams and blood and desperate flight. But then, unexpectedly, new images appeared. Thomas showing her how to collect eggs without frightening the hens, his patient instruction. As she learned to milk the single cow that provided their dairy, the small shelf he had built for her belongings. She woke just before dawn, tear tracks drying on her cheeks, but a strange sense of clarity in her mind. Whatever happened today with Sheriff Davis, she would face it with the same courage that had carried her through the wilderness after the massacre. She had survived the worst day of her life. She could survive whatever came next. Emma dressed carefully in one of the new dresses Thomas had purchased in town, braided her hair neatly, and went downstairs to start breakfast. Thomas appeared soon after, clearly having slept as poorly as she had, but he nodded approvingly at her appearance and the coffee already brewing on the stove. "You're up early," he commented, pouring himself a cup. "Couldn't sleep much," Emma admitted, thinking about what happens next. Thomas leaned against the counter, studying her over the rim of his cup. "And what conclusions did you reach?" "That I want to stay," she said firmly. "That I'll do whatever it takes to make that possible, even if it means telling the whole story. To Sheriff Davis, to a judge, to whoever needs to hear it." A ghost of a smile touched Thomas's lips. "Brave girl." "Not brave," Emma echoed his own words from days earlier. "Just doing what needs doing." They ate breakfast in companionable silence, both lost in their own thoughts. Afterward, Thomas outlined the day's chores, assigning Emma lighter tasks than usual, clearly aware that the impending conversation with Sheriff Davis would drain her emotional reserves. It was nearly noon when they heard the approach of horses, more than one from the sound of it. Thomas set aside the harness he was mending and moved to the front of the house, Emma following close behind. Sheriff Davis appeared over the rise, but he wasn't alone. Beside him rode Lieutenant Carswell, and behind them came a third rider, a woman in a severe dark dress, her horse moving at a more hesitant pace than the men's mounts. "More complications," Thomas muttered, his expression darkening. "Who's the woman?" Emma asked, anxiety tightening her chest. "Mrs. Peterson, most likely. The widow Davis mentioned who does laundry and such in town. Church-going woman with a reputation for proper behavior." He sighed heavily. "Also known for taking in strays, orphaned children mostly." Emma's hand flew to Thomas's arm, gripping it with sudden panic. "They've come to take me away." "Not yet," Thomas said, covering her hand with his own. "Not without hearing us out first. Davis is fair that way." The riders pulled up before the house, dust settling around them in the still midday air. Sheriff Davis dismounted first, tipping his hat to Thomas and Emma. "Ward," he greeted. "Miss Emma, hope we're not interrupting your day too severely." "Sheriff," Thomas replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Lieutenant Carswell, ma'am." He nodded to each in turn. The woman, as yet unintroduced, studied Emma with open curiosity and what appeared to be genuine concern. She was perhaps 50, with iron-grey hair pulled severely back from a face that might once have been pretty, before life and loss had carved deep lines around her eyes and mouth. "Thomas Ward," Sheriff Davis said, his official tone suggesting the formality of what was to come. "I believe you're acquainted with Lieutenant Carswell. This is Mrs. Abigail Peterson, a respected member of our community in Council Grove." Thomas nodded acknowledgement but made no move to invite them inside. His stance was protective, slightly in front of Emma, though not overtly confrontational. "We've come to discuss a matter of some sensitivity," Davis continued, "regarding Miss Emma here and the recent unfortunate events to the west. Perhaps we might speak inside, out of this heat?" Mrs. Peterson suggested, her voice surprisingly gentle despite her stern appearance. Thomas hesitated, then nodded once, sharply. "Of course. Emma, would you fetch water for our guests?" Emma recognized the instruction for what it was, both a genuine gesture of hospitality and a moment for her to collect herself away from scrutinizing eyes. She hurried to the kitchen, filling a pitcher with cool water from the well bucket and gathering cups on a tray. Through the open doorway, she could hear the conversation beginning in the front room. "I believe we can dispense with pretenses, Mr. Ward," Lieutenant Carswell was saying, his crisp military diction carrying clearly. "Sheriff Davis has informed me of his suspicions regarding Miss Emma's true identity and connection to the Wagon train massacre." "Not suspicions," Davis corrected mildly. "Miss Emma confirmed it herself yesterday. She's the sole survivor of that attack." A soft gasp from Mrs. Peterson. "The poor child, how absolutely dreadful." "What I'd like to understand," Carswell continued, his tone hardening, "is why you chose to conceal this information from military authorities investigating the incident, harboring a material witness, creating a false identity. These are serious matters, Mr. Ward." Emma returned with the water, entering the tense atmosphere with trepidation. Thomas stood near the fireplace, his posture rigid but controlled. The visitors had seated themselves around the small sitting area. Davis and Carswell in straight-backed chairs, Mrs. Peterson perched on the edge of the worn sofa. Emma wasn't concealing anything, Thomas said, as she set the tray on the small table. She was recovering from a traumatic experience and exposure that nearly killed her. I made the decision to give her time before subjecting her to official questioning. "A decision that wasn't yours to make," Carswell pointed out. "With respect." "Lieutenant," Thomas replied, his politeness clearly strained, "when I found her half dead at the edge of my property, her well-being became my responsibility. She's a child who'd witnessed the slaughter of her entire family. My priority was her recovery, not your investigation." No one's questioning your motives in saving the girl, Sheriff Davis interjected, his tone conciliatory. That was a Christian act anyone would commend. It's the deception afterward that's caused concern. Emma set down the water pitcher with a deliberate thud, drawing all eyes to her. Mr. Ward was protecting me, she said clearly, forcing herself to meet each adult's gaze in turn. I begged him not to tell anyone what happened. I can't. Her voice faltered as the familiar tightness gripped her chest at the thought of recounting the massacre. Mrs. Peterson rose immediately, moving to Emma's side with surprising quickness. There, child. Don't distress yourself, she said, guiding Emma to sit beside her on the sofa. No one expects you to relive such horrors before you're ready. Emma glanced at Thomas, who gave her a slight nod of encouragement. I want to stay here, she said, addressing her words primarily to Sheriff Davis. Mr. Ward has been kind to me. He's given me a safe place when I had nowhere else to go. That's very natural, dear, Mrs. Peterson said, patting her hand. When we've experienced terrible loss, we cling to the first security we find. But a young girl needs proper care, feminine guidance, a respectable household. Respectability didn't save my family, Emma interrupted, a flash of anger cutting through her anxiety. Mr. Ward did. He found me when no one else was looking. He fed me, gave me clean clothes, a safe place to sleep. He stayed with me when the nightmares came. An uncomfortable silence followed this passionate declaration. Carswell cleared his throat, looking vaguely embarrassed by the emotional turn of the conversation. Davis studied Emma thoughtfully, while Mrs. Peterson's expression hovered between sympathy and disapproval. The law has certain requirements, Davis said finally, directing his words to Thomas. A single man, no matter how well-intentioned, cannot simply take in an orphaned girl without proper legal procedures. There are questions of guardianship, inheritance, education, moral welfare. I understand that, Thomas replied, and I'm prepared to follow whatever legal steps are necessary to ensure Emma's welfare is properly addressed. But I won't see her shipped off to an orphanage or placed with strangers when she's already found some measure of peace here. You're proposing to become her legal guardian, Carswell asked, skepticism evident in his tone. If that's what's required, yes. Mrs. Peterson made a small noise of disbelief. Mr. Ward, while your intentions appear honorable, surely you must see the impropriety. A young girl approaching womanhood, living alone with an unmarried man, no feminine influence, no proper schooling. I can arrange for her education, Thomas interrupted. Hire a tutor or arrange transportation to the school in town. As for feminine influence, he hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. I'm open to suggestions that don't involve removing Emma from the only security she's known since the massacre. Sheriff Davis stroked his moustache thoughtfully. Mrs. Peterson has taken in orphans before, has a comfortable home in town, connections with the church and school. It would be a more conventional arrangement, Ward, one the court would likely favor. Emma felt panic rising within her. She looked from face to face, seeing her fate being decided by these well-meaning but unknowing adults. Please, she said, her voice breaking. Please don't send me away. Not again. I can't bear it. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Thomas moved to stand beside Emma, his presence solid and reassuring. Sheriff, he said quietly, I understand your concerns. I share some of them myself, But Emma has been through enough upheaval. Forcing her into yet another strange situation with people she doesn't know or trust would only compound her trauma. The girl is clearly attached to you, Mrs. Peterson acknowledged, though her tone suggested she found this unfortunate rather than touching. But attachment isn't the only consideration. There's propriety, education, moral development. What if, Sheriff Davis said slowly, as if working through a thought, we found a compromise, a solution that ensures Miss Emma's welfare while respecting her wishes to remain where she feels safe? Thomas raised an eyebrow. What kind of compromise? Mrs. Peterson could visit the ranch regularly, twice weekly perhaps. She could provide feminine guidance, oversee Emma's education, ensure proper womanly matters are addressed. Davis glanced at Emma, a faint flush rising beneath his weathered skin at this delicate reference. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Carswell gets his official statement about the massacre when Emma feels ready to provide it, and you, Ward, begin formal guardianship proceedings through the proper legal channels. That seems a sensible arrangement, Carswell conceded reluctantly, provided Miss Sullivan is eventually able to provide testimony about what she witnessed. The Army needs that information to pursue the war party responsible. Mrs. Peterson looked less convinced. It's highly irregular, she protested. And what will people say? A young girl living out here with a single man, miles from town and proper supervision? They'll say Thomas Ward is doing a Christian duty for an orphaned child, Davis replied, firmly. And if they say otherwise, they'll answer to me. He turned to Emma. Would this arrangement be acceptable to you, Miss Emma? Remaining here with Mr. Ward as your guardian, with Mrs. Peterson visiting regularly to assist with your education and other matters. Hope sparked within Emma. It wasn't perfect. The thought of regular visits from the stern Mrs. Peterson hardly filled her with joy, but it meant staying with Thomas in the place where she had begun to feel safe again. Yes, she said fervently. Yes, that would be acceptable, thank you. Davis looked to Thomas. Ward? Thomas nodded once. I'll do whatever's necessary to make this official and proper. Emma's welfare is my primary concern. And you, Mrs. Peterson? Davis asked. Would you be willing to assist in this manner? It would be a genuine service to the community, helping ensure a traumatized child can heal in stable surroundings. Mrs. Peterson's pinched expression suggested she remained unconvinced, but social pressure and perhaps genuine compassion seemed to win out. Very well, she said with a sigh. I suppose someone must ensure the child receives proper feminine guidance. I'll come Tuesdays and Fridays, beginning next week. Excellent, Davis said, standing as if the matter were settled. I'll draw up the initial guardianship papers for your signature, Ward. The judge will want to review the arrangement in 6 months, make sure everything's proceeding appropriately. Lieutenant Carswell rose as well, though with obvious reluctance. I'll need to report this development to my superiors at Fort Riley. They'll want Miss Sullivan's statement as soon as she's able to provide it. When she's ready, Thomas said firmly. Not before, the lieutenant nodded stiffly. Within reason, Mr. Ward. This is still an official Army investigation. As the adults continued discussing logistics, Emma remained seated, a curious lightness expanding in her chest. For the first time since watching her family die, she felt something beyond grief and fear, a tentative, fragile hope that she might yet build a life from the ashes of her loss. She glanced up at Thomas, who stood beside, her chair solid and steadfast. His expression revealed little, as usual, But when he briefly met her gaze, she saw in his eyes the same cautious hope that had begun to bloom within her own heart. They were strangers still in many ways, a grieving former soldier and a traumatized orphan thrust together by circumstance and tragedy. But in their shared losses and their mutual determination to forge a path forward, they had found something neither had expected, the possibility of family, born not of blood, but of choice and courage, and the simple, profound human need to belong. The seasons changed on the Kansas ranch. Emma and Thomas forged a new life together, two survivors bound by shared loss and unexpected connection. Mrs. Peterson's visits became less frequent as she witnessed the genuine care between guardian and ward. Lieutenant Carswell eventually got his testimony, Emma finding strength in Thomas's unwavering presence as she recounted the horrors she'd witnessed. By the time autumn painted the prairie in gold and amber hues, legal guardianship papers were officially approved. The town's initial whispers faded as they saw the positive change in the once reclusive rancher and the resilient young girl who had survived the unthinkable. On Emma's 13th birthday, Thomas presented her with a handcrafted bookshelf filled with adventures waiting to be discovered. A family tradition, he explained, his voice rough with emotion. Sarah got one at 13 too. That night, as shadows danced across the walls of the home they now truly shared, Emma realized that family could be born from the most tragic circumstances, forged in grief, but sustained by courage, compassion, and choice. Has this story of unlikely connection in the face of terrible loss touched your heart? There are countless tales of resilience on the American frontier waiting to be told. Subscribe to our channel for more extraordinary stories of survival and redemption that history books often overlook. Tomorrow, we'll bring you the remarkable account of a young doctor who changed an entire town's fate during the devastating winter of 1885.